Hello, my name is Stephen Matthews, and today I'm going to be talking about some of our work on food and function in respect of cultural transmission between early Iron Age cooking vessel traditions across North Central and Northeast Africa. Now, this presentation summarizes the research activities of the Connecting Foodways project based at the German Archaeological Institute here in Berlin, undertaken by myself and my co-researcher Ulrike Nowotnick. Now, our project is part of the Entangled Africa program, which is hosting this conference session, and we'd like to thank the organizers for giving us the opportunity to talk a little bit about our work. We've arranged today's presentation into three parts. In the first, I'll describe the general thematic background to the project. In section 2, I'll outline our research questions, the study area of our project, some of our activities and analytical methods, and some of the results of those activities. And in section 3, I'll briefly introduce one of the case studies on interregional interaction that we are working on in our study of early Iron Age culinary traditions, as well as some thoughts on possible transfer processes that we think are worthy of further investigation. Finally, at the end of this presentation, you'll find some bibliographic references to the work and images used in this presentation, and I'll provide some links if you wish to learn a little bit more about our project. Now, in the study of interregional interaction in archaeology, in particular of complex societies, especially in Northeast Africa, the emphasis is typically placed upon what we might call elite media. This includes the diffusion or emulation of particular decorative styles in artifacts, in religious practices, as well as things such as monumental architecture. Now, in the study of Sudan and Ethiopia, this almost inevitably leads to an emphasis not upon inner African interaction, but to extramural connections via Egypt to the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, and across the Red Sea to South Arabia and India, respectively. Now, here the emphasis is typically upon what has been termed formal interaction, such as state-led or state-centered activities, as well as trade and exchange, especially concerning prestige goods. Now, in contrast, the Connecting Foodways project is concerned with the archaeology of non-elite activities, and in particular, the domestic sphere. These are archaeological contexts not typically associated with the study of interregional interaction. Now, this is particularly the case of non-elite domestic foodways, the study of which typically focuses upon the local or household scale. The emphasis upon coarse, handmade cooking pots in our study of food technologies might therefore seem counterintuitive, given that they are typically produced by individual households and rarely traded regionally. But we contend that they provide the perfect counterpoint to traditional elite-centric approaches to interregional connections and cultural transmission, and are a rich source of information on inner African interaction. Now, with our emphasis upon domestic culinary traditions and cultural interaction, the issue of function is a central one, as it is in any study of cultural interaction. Now, leaving aside now the rather tortuous arguments concerning the definition of style and function, generally speaking, a style defined archaeologically typically comprises an idiosyncratic unit, resulting in classes that are quite exclusive, with limited or small-scale distributions in both time and space. Now, functional characteristics, on the other hand, result in archaeological units of quite general composition, resulting in classes that are quite inclusive and as a consequence have instead quite broad distributions. Now, as a consequence, style is more typically relied on in studies of interregional connections exactly because they have these more exclusive distributions and as a consequence of their kind of unique aspect, and therefore assumed to be invented only once, thereby providing material evidence for cultural transmission. Functional characteristics, however, require that we directly address the difficult issue of homology and analogy, and whether two regional expressions of a practical solution are the same due to cultural transmission, or are similar simply due to functional convergence, wherein the same solution was hit upon more than once due to similar circumstances. Now, in the region of North Central and Northeast Africa, we are confronted with a vibrant and dizzying culinary entanglement of contemporary and historical foodways, both African and Eurasian in descent. Now, the archaeological record for culinary traditions in the region, no mere proxy for ethnographic data on contemporary foodways mined, is no less interesting and represents a huge, largely untapped historical resource for the study of the past, in its foodstuffs naturally, but especially in terms of food technologies. Now, in summarising the research aims of our Connecting Foodways project then, we are focusing specifically on domestic contacts, especially non-elite, and in particular food activity areas, or kitchens, from North Central and Northeast Africa, comprising Chad, Sudan, Eritrea, and Ethiopia. And these kitchen contexts provide important information on regional expressions of culinary traditions. Important here is obviously cooking pots, in particular domestic, courseware, handmade vessels. And it's these aspects that form the basis for our study of cultural interaction and interregional transmission. Again, with an emphasis on non-elite processes, especially in African rather than extramural culinary traits. Now, many of these ideas were originally begun to take form in the study of a number of settlement sites that the Connecting Foodways teams were and still are involved in. In particular, the study of the large Meroitic town of Hamadab in central Sudan and the small pre-Axumite town of Zibanadi in northern Ethiopia. Both produced evidence of domestic buildings and in particular food preparation areas or kitchens, as well as important assemblages of handmade cooking wares. Now, the work undertaken at these sites also reflect a more general trend in the wider archaeology of Northeast Africa toward the investigation of settlements and habitation and away from more antiquarian concerns with just temples and palaces. Now, our ongoing work on these contexts, which are incorporated in the Connecting Foodways project, provide the initial basis for helping to select other useful sites across our study area, both old and new, and can provide important regional and chronological manifestations of culinary practices. Now, these food preparation areas then, or kitchens, represent both an important methodological and conceptual device in the archaeological study of culinary traditions. Inevitably, these food preparation areas come in a range of forms, varying greatly across such a vast study area and over 2 millennia. These include large public or communal kitchens, which would have served large groups and contain multiple ovens and large uniform cooking sets, to private domestic kitchens from residential units, often comprising an area that frequently, in archaeological terms, relocated at times to different rooms, as well as outdoor kitchens, often short-lived, perhaps designed to service working groups, as well as individual outdoor hearths and ovens. Now, these kitchen contexts provided a practical means for differentiating specific kitchen assemblages from that of wider and more varied ceramic settlement assemblages as a basis for our further study. And this took two forms. The first being the use of legacy collections in both Europe and Africa. Now, handmade and courseware cooking vessels were often overlooked in earlier excavations in favour of fine and highly decorated ceramics, which then provided important chronological and cultural markers. And as a consequence, these aspects of old assemblages are often understudied, if at all, and present a vast untapped resource, much of which required the application of primary recording processes before we could undertake the collection of samples for other kinds of analysis. And this was obviously combined with in-field study, visiting ongoing missions, through which we established cooperation agreements, allowing us primary access to record new material and again take relevant samples. Now, obviously, these activities were severely affected, first by the successful democratic revolution in Sudan, then the ongoing global pandemic, and most recently by the tragic developments in northern Ethiopia. Now, in this respect, our experience and our experiment with utilizing legacy collections, partly designed to deal with the problematic issue of working in Chad and Western Sudan, proved fortuitous and was expanded as necessary. However, our fieldwork trips also provided an opportunity to undertake limited ethnographic, ethnoarchaeological, and ethnobotanical research on contemporary culinary traditions, in particular in non-urban areas, providing important information on the functional relationship between culinary products, raw foodstuffs, and the mechanical properties of food technologies. Now, we've employed a range of scientific analysis, not because it's fashionable or necessarily scientific to do so, but it's explicitly selected to inform on functional aspects of vessel design, production, selection, and use, and to provide some useful culinary traits to address this problem of determining homologue and analogue in the study of cultural transmission. To this end, samples of cooking vessels, as well as some whole cooking assemblages, were subject to macro and micro materials analysis, informing on functional properties of vessels, including paste composition, firing, and raw materials. We also collected over 200 samples, specifically for organic food residue analysis, as well as the analysis of food crusts on pottery and from soil samples. The organic residue analysis, undertaken in collaboration with Julie Dunn at the University of Bristol, is important in informing on regional and chronological dietary preferences in terms of foodstuffs. In some cases, we've been in a position to compare these with analysis of contemporary animal bone assemblages from some of our sites, and it also formed the basis for looking at possible functional specialization in task-based cooking vessel selection. And finally, this work also provided an important methodological investigation of the viability of studying samples from these legacy collections compared with more recent finds, and the effects of cleaning, conservation, storage abrasion, and other factors in respect of undertaking scientific analysis. Now, these are complemented by the study of archaeobotanical remains undertaken by Dorian Fuller at UCL, helping to identify prevalent crop species from some of our sites. And this is particularly important as our study period comprises a significant period in the agricultural development of North Central and Northeast Africa, with a wider distribution and adoption of domesticated African species such as sorghum and millet over Near Eastern crops, as well as the domestication of teff. Now, on the basis of the combination of these analyses, we have begun to delineate a series of individual culinary markers. And these are the individual archaeological traits, which range from specific morphological forms, in the case of ceramic griddle plates, to select functional traits, in the case of mud impressions and basal indentations, to specific crops, in the case of sorghum, that we have deemed to be most useful in the study of these culinary traditions in interregional perspective. Now, as we move forward, we plan to expand on this list and in particular establish combinations of differing traits in order to model interregional transmission over space and time, and in particular address the issues of fidelity and adaptation. In respect of these culinary markers, one of our primary case studies is the investigation of the development and diffusion of griddle plate technologies across Sudan and northern Ethiopia during the early Iron Age, a food technology that's still commonly used today in the production of flat, pancake-like breads. Now, here we've undertaken a systematic survey of griddle plates from archaeological sites. This included a database of morphological and technological variation and samples for food residue and materials analysis. Important here was establishing a catalogue and chronology for their distribution, and here we're particularly grateful to all the missions working in the area who kindly provided information on unpublished finds. Now, these variables, in particular size of vessels, an important and often overlooked functional dimension, were correlated with the distribution and chronology for Near Eastern and African crops, the latter in terms of both wild and domesticated species. Now, traditionally, as argued, that griddle plate technologies developed in Northeast Africa in conjunction with the domestication and adoption of these African crops, but tentatively the earliest of these in northern and eastern Sudan seem instead to be associated with the use of Near Eastern crops. Typically, in the discussion of these, emphasis is placed upon wheat rather than barley, the use of which is typically relegated to the making of beer and for use with animal fodder. However, barley typically dominates the botanical record for domestic assemblages of this period. Moreover, despite containing gluten, when processed has properties more akin to that of non-gluten African crops, such as sorghum and teff. And barley is often still in use today in conjunction with these griddle plate technologies, and may have offered a transferable technology then in the adoption of African crops in the early Iron Age. The dating of these griddle plates, however, leaves questions as to its origins. The earliest dated examples come first from eastern Sudan, followed by specimens from the early pre-Aksumite of Zibanadi in northern Ethiopia, and at the other end from the Napatan settlement of Kawa in northern Sudan. No single route, therefore, certainly no formal route of interaction in technological transmission across the two areas presents itself. To explore these issues further, we employed network tools, not only in spatial but also chronological perspective, as a means to measure the closeness or intensity of connections between regions over time in terms of the degree of overall trait transmission. We also expanded our study of griddle plates to include examples from across Northeast Africa, in particular Egypt, as well as the Near East, identifying both earlier examples as well as multiple routes of transmission, resulting in a broad spread of development and adaptation, each with a different tempo and mode, perhaps representing a different means of transfer, rather than a single definitive point of origin, therefore, resulting in a uniquely African adaptation. As the intention of this initial analysis will be expanded upon, with further detail coming from our material and organic residue analysis, which we hope will provide further insights on this important culinary marker. To conclude then, I want to briefly consider the nature of these possible transfer processes for cultural transmission, especially given our emphasis upon non-elite and particular domestic foodstuffs and food technologies. Now, as most of our cooking pots are household products made from local clay sources, we're in the position of comparing regional, technological, and technical knowledge rather than empirical examples of vessels. In other words, we're dealing with the transmission of ideas rather than diffusion of artifacts. Formal interaction models, therefore, are generally of little use as an explanatory. Now, ethnographic studies in the region have observed that most domestic cooking vessels produced by the household are done so by women, often including the transfer of knowledge between older and younger members of a household. Now, in an anthropological perspective, these activities are deemed a domain of considerable cultural expression, but a conservative one, resilient to change. However, in long-term archaeological perspective, the household use and production of pottery can often be seen to be a culturally diverse and innovative material environment. And one possible explanation, therefore, might be a local or intra-regional virilocal marriage structure as a transfer mechanism. Whilst this might seem too small a process to address the sort of spatial scales with which we are concerned, in long-term archaeological perspective, population-level processes have the potential to turn into large-scale archaeological patterns, especially over 2 millennia. Of course, despite recent gains in this field, biological kinship remains difficult, if not impossible, to establish in the majority of circumstances, primarily as a consequence of recovery and preservation biases. The recent concept of kinwork, the practice of kinship, one not restricted to biological affiliation, offers perhaps a useful alternative to begin to explore kinship processes for cultural transmission in archaeology. Putting aside its more philosophical and ethnographic aspects, kinwork presents an important archaeological concept for exploring trait transmission, or in our case, culinary kinwork. On behalf of the entire Connecting Foodways team, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to listen to our presentation. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank our friends, colleagues, and research partners, including various missions, institutions, and national authorities, for their continuing support and willingness to share information, allow access to their collections, and take samples for analysis. Without them, this sort of interregional research would simply not be possible. We'd also like to thank our colleagues and partners of the Entangled Africa program, providing a stimulating research environment under which to conduct our research, as well as our colleagues at the German Archaeological Institute. Thank you.